Good morning, everyone. Tatsmewi himyuma kalatiwama. Inamunak was tamyaptayo dimiputempt. Joel Moffett soyapotempt. Good morning, friends and relatives. My name is Joel Moffett. I serve as the Director of Environmental and Special Projects for Native Americans and Philanthropy. And I'm a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe. And I want to welcome you to day 2 of Power and Solidarity. Yeah. Yesterday was phenomenal. I still have visions of Utopia and Black Hawk Singers from Lummi and just all the wonderful conversations in the morning. So we're going to build on that today and really appreciate the discussion we're going to have later on. Really important subject that's near and dear to my heart. Land and conservation and climate change. But before we do that, we want to have a moment to share story and music. Our first performer is Swill Canum. He's a citizen of the Lummi Nation. Yeah. U.S. Army veteran, classically trained violinist, native storyteller, and actor. Swill Canum's compositions incorporate classical influences as well as musical interpretations of his journey from depression and despair to spiritual and emotional freedom. The music and stories that emerge from his experiences have been transforming people's lives for decades. Please welcome to the stage Swill Canum. Yeah.
We're here. I had a whole beautiful idea, and I'm just throwing that away because I had a beautiful conversation with the workers over here, and I'm changing everything I was planning on doing. So I figure I have about 17 minutes to rock your world. And I promise that even though this is an improv presentation, I promise, yes, I promise that I will share from the core of my heart how I survived the traumas of my childhood. Trauma is when something bad happens, but because of the circumstances you're in, you're not allowed to feel your feelings. Now, I wish I invented that phrase, but that came from Jane Middleton Moss. And she's pretty awesome because she's like friends with Oprah. When I first heard that phrase, I realized I was traumatized. Because when I was a little boy, and I'm talking like 4 years old, almost 5, my cousins were all lined up in a yard, and they were saying, Red Rover, send Pee-wee on over. Pee-wee's my, we call it nickname, whatever, but I consider it my real name. It's what my auntie calls me, because I couldn't say Sweet Pea, like Sweet Pea on Popeye. I used to wear my dad's long white t-shirt. I looked like Sweet Pea on Popeye. And I couldn't say it came out Pee-wee. What's your name? Pee-wee. So when they called me to run over in Red Rover, I watched cartoons. So I put my horns up and I was building up my momentum. And I ran across that field. And I was putting my head side to side so the wind would blow past my ears and my long hair. And I'd run as fast as I could, and I'd wiggled because I couldn't do the head going back and forth and running as fast as I can without wiggling. And I jumped on the pile, and everybody stayed together. They all stayed together, and I couldn't break through. And we fell on top of each other, and we laughed. Oh, we laughed hard until the caseworkers showed up. They had my cousins line up on an imaginary line. They weren't allowed to step onto the yard anymore. Caseworkers went into the house to talk to my mom. She came out crying, screaming, "No, no." And they put us in the car and they said, "You're going to a really good home." Before I go further into this conversation, I want you to remember that I'm here. I survived what I'm about to tell you. Not only that, I survived with joy. I survived with love in my heart. They took me away to foster care, and I remember we dropped off my little brother Clyde, at a home, and then we were in a Volkswagen Bug, like with the motor in the back, right, which was on the res. All the motors were in the front of cars, so it was really confusing. And my brother and I were crawling around in the way back, and the engine was revving up. It was about to go up a hill in Bellingham called Alabama Hill, and we were going to go up to the top of Alabama Hill, and the engine was revving up. And I remember seeing in the mirror two beautiful, kind eyes of the caseworker looking in the mirror saying, "You two," my older brother Art and I, "you two are going to a really good home. So make sure you let them know how happy you are to be there, because I don't want to have to place you in another home." Immediately, the only thing I thought was, what kind of home did you just drop off my little brother at? And I remember that my true feelings didn't matter. No matter what I could teach, I could show people how happy I am. And I developed a skill. I want to ask you to please look at your life and realize that your talents are what got you through the most difficult times. And I want to point out something. Where we're from, the young ones, they just came from the spirit world. So when a speaker's speaking and they give us the joy of that voice, it's a blessing. It's a beautiful thing. When I survived foster care, I remember I was maybe 19 years old, sitting on the couch of my uncle Art Lane, Similano was his Indian name. And we're watching basketball because he was a basketball guy, loved watching basketball. And Whitney Houston was singing, and I interrupted him, and I said, Uncle Art was talking to me, and he was saying things like, really important things. I said, Uncle, I really want to hear what you have to say. Please remember it. But Whitney Houston's singing. So, can we wait? And she goes, "Who's Whitney Houston? She's the most beautiful woman in the world, and she sings this most amazing song. The children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." And Uncle Art was like, "Oh, so she's a liar too?" I was like, "Uncle, the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." He goes, "No. The words of your elders are what you will remember in the future." And I realize we've been putting a burden on our children that we as elders need to bear. The words of my elder are what I'm sharing with you today. That was then, this is now. The children are not our future. They're more important than that. They are our right now. They are our present. They are a gift. The word present is really important. It's one of the few compound words of a suffix and a prefix. Pre and sent. A gift before it's opened and becomes what it is. That's who our children are. The most precious gift to now. Our job as elders is to hold the future up for them. Our job is to speak from our heart. I survived trauma. I survived the worst that life has to offer, my own thoughts about myself and others, with the words from my elders. My fourth grade teacher, Kathy Dorr, is my hero. And I mean that in every sense of the word. She saved my life. She knew something wasn't right. And I remember she invited Roger Alexander, the late great Roger Alexander, to our fourth grade classroom at Silver Beach Elementary School. I was a foster kid there. He played the violin for us. And when he was done, he said, "Who here wants to learn how to play the violin?" And could you mute me for a second? Check. Uh-oh. I remember he said, "Does anyone else want to play the violin?" All the kids on the playground, they said things like, "Whoever heard of an Indian violin player? Lummies don't play the violin. They play the wood flute or the hand drum or something like that. They don't play the violin." But I had a memory of an old man, an elder, sitting on a three-legged stool like the kind used for milking cows. And he would play for the river. I remember crawling down to him in my dad's long white t-shirt. I looked like Sweet Pea on Popeye. I remember putting my hand on his knee and looking over his belly of wisdom. There's a, okay. Yeah. I'm working on one myself, and I remember the sound of that violin coming down and filling my soul with purpose, vision, clarity, and understanding. So when the kid said, "Whoever heard of a Native American violin player?" I told him, "Hey, it comes with a bow." Stupid. I took that parent permission slip to my foster parents and I said, "Please, can I learn how to play the violin?" And they said, "Not no, but H-E double toothpick, no." I said, "Why?" I said, "If you haven't noticed, we have an 18-year-old daughter of our own. And she's been playing since fourth grade at Silver Beach Elementary School, and she's just starting to sound good on that thing. So there's no way you're going to play the violin. We don't know how long you're going to be in our home." I was devastated. I took that blank parent permission slip back to my fourth grade teacher and I put it on the stack of all the signed parent permission slips. Their parents were making them play the violin. I wanted to play the violin and I couldn't. She said, you know, it's my first year of teaching. What are they going to do, fire me? And she signed the parent permission slip, which allowed me to play. A school instrument at school. She was present to my honor. Every element of honor, truth, feelings, significance, and the passions that I act on by my own volition. Truth, feelings, significance, and volition. From her honor, she saw my honor before I knew what honor was. All I knew before then was trauma, where my feelings don't matter. So in her honor, I'm going to play this piece called The Honor of All. Your honor. If you are true to your truth, feelings, significance, and the passions that you act on by your volition, you will honor everyone. This is called The Honor of All. It starts with one note. Do not underestimate the power of your honor. Do not underestimate the power of your story. Do not underestimate who you are and who you are worthy to associate with. I went from being a foster kid, young adult, suicidal, overcoming that depression, being a street performer. I wrote that piece at the Pike Place Market. Street performer. To now, I'm on the board of the Seattle Symphony. All because what Uncle Art was trying to say to me, you have gifts, son, and it ain't a gift unless you give it away. Share your gifts for the people. What helped you to heal, what helped you to survive, other people need those gifts. So I leave the stage with this one thought for you as a gift. Do your best. Pray it's blessed. And let the great spirit of love take care of the rest. Natsiam, Let's Hashke.
Wow, absolutely beautiful, inspiring, story of resilience, and the medicine, the gift that you passed on to us here today. Thank you so much. Let's give Will one more round of applause. You know, he's done so much for Indian country, so much for communities around this world. And I have a personal thank you as well. I mentioned to him coming up, but he performed at the Potlatch Fund Gala probably 5 or 6 years ago at Squaxin Island, and my daughter, she's half Quinault, half Nez Perce, and she's in a program called Kids in Concert over at Squamish tribal land. And she was just starting to play the violin at that time. And Swill, after 4 hours of this gala and performing and storytelling and inspiring everybody, he took the time after that long evening to give her an impromptu lesson, like half an hour dedicated to her. And I can't thank you enough. She's still, just to see a native violinist, who has that much love in their heart and their playing, and she was definitely inspired and continues to play to this day. So thank you. Next, we will hear from NAP and AAPIP board directors. Please welcome Nami Kano, and Tony Johnson.
Thanks, Joel, and so that was amazing. So I feel like we have to give another. That was so amazing. I really just feel now we've really brought spirit into the space. So good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing on day 2 of Power and Solidarity? We still feeling energized? Yeah, it's been amazing to be with everyone, new friends and old friends after 3 years. So my name is Manami Kano. I'm an AAPIP board member, and just feel very honored to be here with my colleague Tony Johnson, board director of NAP, to be able to introduce this next session on climate, land, and conservation. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my personal connection and why this topic is so important to me and kind of formative to me. Back in the late 90s, I worked for an organization called the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, APEN, and that was one of my big first lessons in multiracial organizing and solidarity. We were part of the national environmental justice movement that focused on the unequal burdens of environmental hazards on communities of color, indigenous communities, and focused on a framework of environmental racism that really shaped the direction of where my work went. But the power in working with groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network, We Act in New York, SNEEJ and SWAP in the Southwest, and the many other organizations across the country in multiracial solidarity to be able to shift the agenda on what we think about environmental work, conservation, preserving the land, our interdependence with each other and the planet, has really been so critical. And yet, here we are 20 years later, and the loudest voices defining what the problems are and the solutions for climate change are still not in our communities in the same way that business leaders, wealthier governments, and sometimes scientists have been able to shape that agenda. But what would it look like if communities that were most affected were the ones leading that charge around how we should be finding the solutions and making the decisions? So I'm very honored today that we're going to be hearing from leaders in Native American communities, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities who are working locally and globally on these issues and looking at the realities of colonization and displacement, of militarization, and also the considerations of sovereignty on how we should be moving forward. So I'm very excited and honored to be part of that conversation. And hand it over to Tony.
Well, Slachawim Kanawit Laksta, Pikunchi Slushtumdum Naika, Pasmitlet Elip. My name is Nastio. My tax name's Tony Johnson, and I am a proud and relatively new NAP board member. So really want to thank Manami for the introduction and those important words, and of course Swill as well. Just really Kunchi Slush Kana Ikdamawawa. Just really moved. I think everybody felt that, and very powerful. If you'll let me, I'm going to do this in my Chinook language. Elip. Kunchi Boston Tillicum Cheeseless Kaboguk and Saika Ili Coldest Liska Mamuk Mislet Kotluska Mislet Kaba Ili Kotlus Chagworthless Munk Mislet Ugu Coldest Munk Mislet Quas Kagwa Kaboguk and Saika Ili Kanakata Ugug Kotless Munk Kagwa was Hayuik the Mislet Kabuguk and Saika Ili was Gumducks was Geemducks Kotless Munkagwa was Tukoka Hayu Mislet Kpa Kabanaika Ili was Munkgumducks Sluska Kotapus Mislet Platypus mithlite flush, kabuga kinsaika, ili aqua, but cogopus hiluk olan tluska, conacata tluska tlusmunkagupi, well, six dumdum and sagapus tlusmunkagupi, koi aski, tluska munk pus scheme ducks, munk dumdum pus scheme ducks, and saika. Well, Cotton Saika Ankaditilifum Mithlet, or Cotton Saikatsa Mithlet, Kaba, Ugu Kansaika Chinukili. When the Americans first came to our country, or my country, at the mouth of the Columbia River, my family's Chinook, my dad's Chinook from there. That's where I was born and raised, and where I fortunately work for the Group Health Foundation as a program officer. But, you know, it's the way of it, I guess, to just put the culture, the way of living, whatever, right on top of our place. And it just seems a horrible crime, because every rock in our homeland, every river inlet, every creek has a story, and those stories have teachings, and those teachings tell us how we're supposed to live in our place. And it just, like I said, feels like an absolute crime that someone would come and just plant a way of thinking on top of ours, because if they'd only taken the time to listen to us or have respect for us or our ways of thinking, they, things would be so different. And so I guess my hope, as we're doing, as we're setting up for this talk now, from folks that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, I'll say the colonization and climate crisis, our hope is that we're all going to leave here feeling stronger feels, I guess, for revitalizing, right? The actual way of living on our places for the benefit of our youth, for our communities, and I'll say the world as a whole. And it really is my community's hope that the folks that are living there, old white families that came not a long time ago, but came not too long, came first, and then all of our immigrant brothers and sisters too, that folks are going to have an opportunity to, and I'll say the patience and the skill set that it takes to learn our traditions in the sense of approaching our place in a different way, so that things really can change for the benefit of all of us. And with that, more than I meant to say. Wasla, hayamasi. Thank you, folks.
Makas Katsiayo, thank you, Manami and Tony, for your welcome and your thoughts. Next we'll have a performance from Troy Asaki. Troy is a local 3-time Grand Slam poetry champion and recipient of grant awards from Artist Trust and the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. He has earned fellowships from Kundiman, Hugo House, and the Jack Straw Cultural Center. His poetry has appeared in Crazy Horse, The Margins, Muzzle Magazine, Poetry Northwest, Tinderbox Poetry Journal, and many more. He holds a Juris Doctor degree from the Seattle University School of Law, where he conducted Know Your Rights workshops for young people at the King County Juvenile Detention Center, and interned at Creative Justice, an arts-based alternative to incarceration for youth in King County. Troy is the grandson of Filipino and Japanese immigrants and we are honored to have him here today. Welcome, Troy.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. Feeling very moved, and just want to thank everyone who's helped ground this morning's space. Again, I'm Troy Osaki, he, him pronouns. I am mixed Filipino-Japanese. Shout out all the mixed people in the room. Yeah? Some? Okay, sweet. And I was born and raised here on Coast Salish land, also known as Seattle, Washington. If you were here yesterday and you learned one new thing or felt moved by something, can you make some noise? Yeah? Okay. Oh my gosh, beautiful. Okay, amazing. Well, I'm very honored to be here on day 2 with you all and to continue the learning. I'll be offering several poems for you, and my hope is that we'll, one, just deepen the lessons that started yesterday, and then 2, to help fortify our spirits for the long fight ahead, knowing that every week, if not every day, there's a heightened crisis that we're facing, right? And I use the word heightened rather than new crisis intentionally, knowing that these problems that we're facing often aren't new, right? They've actually been here for quite a while, if not centuries, and often have impacted many marginalized communities for so long. So we're just seeing them in manifest in different ways now. And so that said, I'm particularly very excited about this year's theme and title around solidarity, knowing that our communities don't need to be saved or freed by other people, right? But rather, what we're in need of understanding is that all of our struggles are connected, particularly by the same violent systems that harm us all, right? And if we face them together, if we struggle against them together, then we have a better chance at winning a new world, right? Free of oppression and free of exploitation together. And so, that all said, I'd like to start with some poems about the Philippines. Shout out any Filipinos, kumusta? And I think it's very fitting because as an archipelago of over 7,000 islands and over 100 dialects and over 100 indigenous communities, our people didn't truly start identifying as Filipino until we were colonized by Spain and started to fight back for liberation together. So I'd like to start off with a poem about my first trip back to the Philippines back in 2017, which was a very special trip because I was the first person in my immediate family to return to the Philippines after my grandpa had left towards the end of Japanese occupation in 1945. So we'll get this started, and I hope you all enjoy. This is the hardest part about my first night in the Philippines is the mosquito bites. Lonnie says they are low-key excited I'm here. Now they'll be bitten less with more bodies in the house. And by sunrise, my legs are licked of all their blood, and I'm unsure of what's louder. The flock of honking jeepney across the street, or the welts on my ankle pulsing bright red. I begin to carry a tin of Tiger Balm wherever I go. And in Tarlac, fire ants swarm the farms. I walk barefoot between stalks of rice, discover a sting in each step. Bending down, I brush away their bites, pluck a bush of thorns out of my heel. Nico says, they're here to defend the countryside. Before leaving for Quezon City, I'm bit again. The back of my biceps swells like summer heat. I jog upstairs to the shared room I sleep in, inspect the floorboards I use as a mattress. Between the cracks is a bed bug, brown as coconut husk. I bathe my backpack in hand soap and water, pay 60 pesos to clean my clothes at the laundromat. My t-shirts smell like lemon detergent. I slide them into a single Ziploc bag and roll out the air. I am convinced all insects need to breathe too. Perhaps my blood is still someplace in the Philippines. The spout of a mosquito, teeth of a fire ant. Maybe there's a bed bug crawling through dust on a full stomach of my body's scarlet ocean. And if I could, I think I'd offer my blood again. Okay, thank you. So in 2020, I was very fortunate to visit Filipino organizers in Europe who were exiled from the Philippines because of their political organizing. And unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and then I had to take an emergency flight back home to ensure I didn't get shut out from the US. And shortly after, one of the organizers I met passed away while still overseas. And so since then, I have just been reflecting on how so many Filipinos are overseas, whether it's because of their organizing or because they are in need of better opportunity elsewhere. We have about 6,000 Filipinos leaving the Philippines on average every day. And so I am, this poem I'd like to share is a dream I have of all the people who want to returning home. And I just like to dedicate it to everyone who continues to organize or continues to fight, even in the face of everything that doesn't want them to, right? And so this poem is another poem in which my grandpa is gone. My comrade's kids ask for his ashes to be sent to the Philippines, not his chanellas, his half-filled carton of cigarettes, or strands of hair found by the coffee pots. The birthday balloons strung to his bed, comrades humming maligayang batik to wrinkled sheets. When what's left of him lands in Luzon, I want a national day of mourning for every person still overseas. I want every one of them returned to. The au pair standing in Paris rain, baguette in hand. The line cook headed south for Barbados on a cruise ship. His whole barcada, dishwashers from Manila, bus boys old as my comrade when detained by Marcos himself. The sommelier whose bald head is shaped like my uncle's. When they dock, I want them served a ribeye steak and oakiest red wine. I want cold water poured on their sunburnt faces. The president's palace to sink to the bottom of our brilliant ocean. And when every Filipino returns, I'll clip the graveyard grass growing above my grandpa, seal it in a bag, and bury it in the province where he learned to trap fish with his mother. Japanese lineage. I'm fourth, fifth generation Japanese, so also known as Yonsei Gosei. I had family who were contract laborers and were pulled to Hawaii to be sugar or pineapple plantation workers. And then I have family who moved to the West Coast and were eventually incarcerated during the war. And I'd like to offer these poems just in reflection of all of what my family went through to ensure that I'm here today, which I imagine is similar to a lot of families and communities in this room. And so these poems are inspired by my family's history, but I'd like to offer it to all of our families here in this room in our communities. This piece is called "My Grandparents Plant a Pear Tree in the Backyard of Their Home in Northeast Portland." When my grandpa says, "Say, how many jars do you think we have left?" My grandma replies, "Gosh, at least 6 or 7. They offer me a pint of slices they canned months before. Tell me how canned pears last years beyond expected. I trust that what they know about preservation is airtight. And when the season is kind, they gather a bundle of barrel-shaped fruit, bury a handful of wedges beneath 2 splashes of water, then sprinkle in sugar before sealing them snug. I'm not surprised my grandparents know preservation like a past life, like they've practiced for centuries now. For as long as I've known them, they've kept this family alive. Once, before tending to a backyard full of fruits, my grandpa was a school teacher. In his first interview, he was told, "The school board chairman doesn't like Japs. And rather than let the corners of his body bruise like a rotting peel, he replied, 'Is that right, you say? He doesn't like Japs. Well then, I'll take the job.' And before that, my grandma was snatched from her family's grove, boxed away in a warehouse made of barbed wire. She found sugar and whatever wicked shelf America shoved her in. And still, when the war ended, it didn't disappear. Years later, in a schoolhouse hallway, a boy who smelled of famine yelled, 'You must be mad because your country lost.' And I don't know if any word has been invented for that kind of patience, to soothe a rage that would burn 1,000 acres of orchard if given the chance. Maybe miracle is the closest I can think of. Maybe my grandparents are so good at not giving up, they gain another life whenever someone fails to poison the patch of soil they breathe on. Maybe in a past life, they were blooming pears that outlived the coldest winter." Minidoka is the first camp your grandma is incarcerated in. Crystal City is the second. You thumb through your grandma's yearbook from when her middle school self wore whatever dress her mother could conjure. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor girl from another barrack who grew out of it. Maybe it was unhemmed but fit well enough. In camp, your grandma couldn't miss school without every other kid finding out. And so instead, she missed her bedroom, the daffodils off 14th near the temple, how smooth Lake Washington was midsummer. She missed her dad, who looked like her but was taken elsewhere. In Germany, a grenade goes off and your grandma is shoveled onto a train. Texas smells like pine wood and sunburn. There's an unending fence similar to before. Your grandma is back with both her parents, and the war somehow feels a bit bearable. The country you and her were born in eventually wins, and still she isn't given back her dad's laughter, his morning hum, all of what disappeared for 3 years until her family was imprisoned together. Decades after your grandma is released, she returns to each camp her dad wrote to her from. Montana, Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas. The land is bare, and whatever mess hall or guard tower was once there isn't, as if the war is done, as if there isn't a daughter left who's separated from her dad. Somewhere a daughter still is, if not in a camp, then at an airport or behind a wall. Somewhere a dad, not your grandma's, hasn't seen the sun in 3 days, hasn't breathed beyond cement walls since before detainment, and still your country says it won the war, says it's proud of its name in its mouth. You are in your grandma's home as she bakes a sheet of sugar cookies. Her memory becomes a kitchen knife you hide beneath your pillow. You sharpen its blade every night. You trust no country that can smile and say its own name with so much of someone else's blood in its mouth. It's 1941, and you are at the center of your grandma's camp. She's looking at a mountain miles away, says, sometimes I stand here, right here, staring, and I swear I can hear the other side. Oh my gosh, thank you all so much. I'll be sharing my last poem with you all this morning. Again, my name is Troy Osaki. This piece started from a collaborative poem that I started with young people from an organization called You Speak Seattle. It's a literary spoken word organization here in the city. And the young folks gave a prompt about what would the world look like after the revolution, right? Like after we win a new world. And so we all wrote together, and then a little later, I changed what I wrote into this poem. And so this piece is really for them, and it's for everyone who knows that there's a world that is better out there, and that it's possible to get there if we struggle for it. So this is my last piece, and it is titled, "In the New World, We Laugh, and This Time We Mean It." Here, every detention center demolished. In its place, a really good dance floor. Every mother separated from her child is now not. We've disarmed the state, strung up its rifles, and made wind chimes of its weapons. Each song sounds like ceasefire, a chorus of checkpoints undoing themselves. The only bullet left spins in reverse, and all the corpses with holes come back to us. Here, every auntie forced overseas to find work returns home, and when they do, they have something to return home to. Foreign corporations are evicted, and the brightest crops since colonization bloom. Even the massive hole that held a mosque before the airstrike holds a mosque again. Here, no nation occupies another nation. Military bases are sunken lands, and armored cars rust below the ocean. Drones are scraps of unflyable metal, each one reimagined as a spaceship by every child it couldn't kill. Lorena blurts out a brilliant smile. Andres's chest is full of chuckles, and the shiny slide they're racing to is made of melted down tanks. Something, not a war, is taking their breath away now. We say cage and forced removal, meaning what no one has ever seen. Ice is a memory's memory. Every generation whispers its name softer than the last yesterday. I roamed the Seattle Public Library, learned all of what the old world couldn't keep alive. The deportation hearing, the no-fly list, the interrogation room, wherever it is. Outside is a museum of ashes. Everything we incinerated to get here is on display. And we've saved enough space in case we ever have to scorch the bones of something else again. Here in the new world, we laugh. And this time, we mean it. Thank you all so much. I hope the rest of this conference is great. Appreciate it.
So powerful, so powerful. That energy, I can feel it. I know we all feel it. I want to thank Troy one more time for infusing us with that passion, getting us going. That really sets the stage for today's plenary. It's about land, climate, and conservation. There's no issue within Indian country that doesn't touch or have a foundation in land and climate. When we talk about the protection and restoration of our lands, our waters, our first foods, this is a priority in all of our communities. But bringing in Native American and Pacific Islander leaders to discuss what that means for our communities is not always a priority for those with decision-making power. We're lucky to have 3 leaders today to share their perspectives. Please welcome my good friend and rock star environmental warrior, Alyssa Macy, citizen of the Confederate Tribes of the Warm Springs, and CEO of Washington Environmental Council, who will moderate this discussion and introduce you to the panelists. Welcome, Alyssa.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to go ahead and get into this. Great conversation this morning. I know many of you are at the point in your life where you get a piece of paper, and unless it's in 16 font, you can't really read it. So I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see what's going on. Okay. Really excited to be here. We have a slight change in our program today in that Fawn Sharp won't be joining us. Got called to DC, so I'll be providing some words, not a whole lot. I'm really excited to engage with both of you. So we have Joe Enlett, who represents the Federated States of Micronesia Consulate General. And we also have Amy Barnes, founder and CEO of Huanani Partners in Hawaii. Did I say it right? Yes. So excited. tribal communities, indigenous communities around the world all have creation stories. They have a story about where their people came from. We as individuals also have our own creation stories. So I'm interested to know from both of you, tell us a story about how you came to this work and how you came to be with us today in Seattle.
Hello? Oh, all right. Aloha mai kako. Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you. And before I start, I just want to thank the organizers. Thank you to Suk in particular for inviting me to be here. I have to say, after being in pandemic world for so long, it's just really feels very restorative to be here with all of you. So thank you for having me. Gosh, where to start? So my name is Amy Barnes, and I'm here with you from the Pai'aina of Hawaii. I live on the windward side in Kailua. But my origin story, I was born and raised in California, and I think we heard this morning a really powerful story about trauma. Joe and I were talking a little bit about trauma this morning, and I would say that I think for me, one of the sort of foundational traumas has been a separation from my culture. So I grew up in California, but I am Native Hawaiian. Spent a lot of time visiting my family in Hawaii, but never really had the opportunity to live there. And so always felt a sense of real estrangement from my culture. And also a real calling to serve the land, serve my community. And so after spending about 20 years working on climate, working in international negotiations, and working in state government in California for former California Governor Jerry Brown, I was fortunate enough to be able to move home a few years ago. And I'll just share the way that I described the feeling of being home in Hawaii after being gone my whole life to somebody after, growing up in California, which I also feel is my home. I said, being in California feels like walking into your house and you have the familiar smells and you see all your furniture. Going back to Hawaii for me has felt like going back to my mother, just that feeling of being with your mom, that sense of comfort. So it's been really powerful for me. I have two small children. I have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, and so it's been really important for me to bring them back home and have them have the opportunity that I didn't have to grow up there, be close to the land that is a part of them, where their, the bones of their ancestors are, and to learn about their culture. I was really moved also by the comment about they're not gifts if you don't give them away. I thought that was really beautiful. And I guess I'll just say that maybe one last thing by way of sort of origin story or introduction, but I feel like over the past 20 years, having done a lot of work in climate and energy, so I've spent time in the international climate negotiations, which I know we'll talk about a little bit, again in policy, working in the nonprofit world, and I really felt like I wanted to bring those gifts back to Hawaii. And so earlier this year, I was appointed by Governor Ige to serve on the Board of Land and Natural Resources, which is a really big kuleana for me. The Land Board makes decisions about over 1 million acres of land that are held in trust by the state. And I had a lot of questions and misgivings about, whether it was right for me to step into that role. I did a lot of consultations with my family, my kumus, my elders, and I had a lot of people encourage me to do it. I had a lot of people tell me not to do it. Some of those discouragements, I think, were related to the fact that land is a very controversial issue in Hawaii. But I also had some people discourage me because they felt that, I had not been back home long enough, that I really needed to be there longer and, put in my time. And my response to those reactions was that I do feel like one of my gifts has been this experience that I've had working on climate and land and energy for so long. And so it really has been a gift for me to be able to serve our state and our people in that way. And I look forward to talking about that experience, climate, and everything in between in this panel.
Thank you, Amy. Praranim ay verisin parkiriso jabur redi fason kichiviran obrevi. Thank you all, and thank you to the organizers and Suk Ree for inviting me to be here. It is a real honor to be here and sitting with you all, learning from everybody since yesterday today. And I thought in my mind, well, from last night's amazing performance, today's amazing performance, why am I even talking here? I know, but my story begins in a small village called Sapuk, on an island called Wera that was named Moen after some European who was lost at sea and stumbled onto the islands of Micronesia. I remember as a child growing up, I grew up right next to the mangrove. I can smell the mangrove. I can tell the difference between an old mangrove and a new mangrove. And I can tell the different textures of the leaves of different types of species of mangrove. All of this stuff, I didn't think much of it because that's how we grew up. We also have a lot of mosquitoes near the mangroves, so I think my blood is circulating back in Micronesia still. I remember going to school and then climbing up a coconut tree and resting in the palms and reading a book, studying. That was my study place because it was the most comfortable place, actually. I remember stories where we were told as young children by my grandma, who would tell me stories about how we came to that island, but we're really from this island. But they were actually from that island, and then, so we just kind of moved around. But that was natural, for us growing up, knowing that, oh yeah, we're related to so-and-so. And I grew up in a family of hundreds, literally hundreds of cousins. And there is no word for cousin. It's brother, sister. There is no word for uncle and auntie in my language. It's mom and dad. And that's the community that I grew up with, where your relatives are the people, but also the trees and the land and everything. And all of that is held in perfect balance and unity. But then there were stories also that were told to me. My grandmother would tell me that as a little girl, there would be sirens, that would go off, these alarms that would go off on the entire island, which meant for them as a little girl and her parents, they would run into the side of the mountains to hide because there were bombs that would come and start dropping all over the islands. Those stories you'll never read in textbooks today. In fact, growing up in Micronesia, I never read those stories when I was learning about World War II in the Pacific. I did not see a single mention of the Micronesian islands. And I thought, were my ancestors lying to me? But those are the stories that formed me. Those are the stories where I find my origin story in. Then I moved when I became an adult. It's kind of funny to say adult because in the islands, you're still a boy until your 40s. I'm just turning 40 this year, so I don't know what that means. But so I consider myself an island boy. My whole worldview, my values, and everything are rooted in the culture and in the islands and in the ocean. I'd like to say land, ocean, climate change. Because somebody said last night, we are the ocean. So I come from that place, and I moved directly from that little island that you can walk around its entirety in a few hours to Los Angeles, a different island. And I was shocked, cultural shock. I went into some depression, and I didn't know if I could make it. I came to get an education. Now I learned that you don't come and get an education, you make an education. But that's why I moved to the US, to try to find my place in this world as well. But that also ended up in a lot of trauma for me as an immigrant, as an islander, in the heart of the United States, the land of opportunity, they say. And I struggled. The history of Micronesia has been intertwined with the history of colonialism and militarization. Do you know that in the Marshall Islands, back in the 50s, the United States tested 67 nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands, devastated the entire ecosystem. The islands there were used as testing grounds. And the reason why, through the Cold War until today, this nation enjoys being the #1 nuclear power in the world. But that's on the backs of and on the lives of many people from the Marshall Islands who were affected. The amount of energy detonated by those 67 bombs combined is equal to 7,000 times the bombs that were dropped on Japan. That's how devastating it is. But that's also part of my story. And continues to when World War II was fought. Do you know that the plane that took the bomb to be dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that plane took off from where? In Micronesia. There is a lot of that history in my own history. And coming to the US, I'm now just beginning to appreciate that story as well. So fast forward, I came to the US. I made an education here in the US, but I also was just instilled with the passion to serve my community because I knew what it was like to come from that environment and then come into a place where you're not told. Your story is not told in textbooks. Your story is not told anywhere. You seem invisible. And because you're invisible, policies are made that don't serve you. There are no resources that name you. And so I had that passion of organizing. We organized what's called the Kofa Alliance National Network, which is an alliance of advocates that promote social justice and economic justice for Micronesians who have migrated to the United States and live in the US, but are barred from a lot of different services because of the policies that are set in place that govern our lives. I studied something else, but I was thrown into policy work just because I was following my passion as a policy person. But that's my story. And then 5 years ago, I was appointed as Consul General for Micronesia to continue to work in organizing community, but also serving their needs on the policy level as well as on the grassroots level. I will stop here because I know stories can go on and on, but that's my origin story.
Thank you so much, Joe and Amy. I'll also share a little bit about my origin story. I was raised on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation in Central Oregon by parents, my father, Jim Macy, my mother, Carla Dalton. They met in the early 70s at an AIM, American Indian Movement, 49er. So for folks who know what that is, that's where they met. My father courted my mother, and she had just returned to the West Coast from participating in the Trail of Broken Treaties that went out to Washington, D.C. and took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. While it was being taken over, apparently Mom was doing laundry, so she had to crawl through a window after they were already in the building. So these were funny stories that I learned later. Growing up on the reservation, I lived with my father, and he was a man of great intellect. He spent a lot of time reading, very late into the night. I remember being told to go to bed, and I would sneak out and look over the banister rail, and he would be reading and writing. And so I would always ask him, "What are you reading?" And he would tell me about our treaty. And he would talk about the 1855 treaty with the Middle Bands of Oregon, and then he would go on a very long speech about why I should learn all things treaty, and I needed to know this, and it was really important. Well, I was really little. I was like 8. So that was kind of a lot for an 8-year-old, but it kind of got, in my head, and I was always curious, what does this mean? I grew up in a community where I didn't always feel welcome. My mom is enrolled in the Navajo Nation. She's half Navajo and half Hopi, so a Navajo-Hopi. If you're familiar with tribes, that's like a conflict of itself. And on my father's side, my maternal great-grandfather is Japanese. And so that's part of our history in the community. So I wasn't at many times enough in my community because I wasn't a full-blood, I had a grandfather who was white. So there was some times where I was kind of felt like I didn't belong, but I was there and you weren't getting rid of me. When I was a senior in high school, my father lost his life drinking and driving. And when we buried him in a cold January morning, I remember standing over his grave, and in our way, we all cast dirt on the casket, everyone. So I was walking, and I stood at the foot of his casket, and I let that dirt go. And I said, "I promise you that I will do something with my life, that I'll get an education, and I'll come home, and I will serve this community." And that was a promise I made. I went on to graduate from high school, and I left. I went to Arizona State, University of Minnesota. I lived a lot on the East Coast and in the Midwest. And then one day I came back to the Pacific Northwest for the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Conference, and it was out in Umatilla. And I was standing there, and you know when you see familiar people and you're like, "You look different, I know you." So trying to just place people as I had been gone for years, coming home only to see family, not spending a lot of time in the community. And we were getting ready to eat, and they came out and they started singing. And I was listening to these songs that we hear in the Longhouse. And I remember standing there and tears were rolling down my face. And I was crying, and my friend goes, "Why are you crying? The food's not going to be bad. It'll be okay." And I was like, "No, it's just, I feel like something's pulling me, like I'm being pulled somewhere." And I left that conference, and my mind was really going, and I said, "I think it's time for me to come home." And so I had that conversation with my friend, and I said, I think I'm ready to come home. She says, "Oh, perfect. You can stay with me until you get on your feet." And I said, "Okay, cool." 2 weeks later, I had a job, and 3 weeks later, I was back in the Pacific Northwest. And it was like the Creator was paving the way, opening the doors for me to come back. I stayed in Portland for about 9 months, and then I moved back to Warm Springs, my own community, where I had grown up, where everybody that I grew up with, it was like this really strange moment, like a time capsule, going back to the res. And I served my community as a chief operations officer for 4 years, which is the longest serving coup ever. So for folks who work for tribes, like, I did it. Yeah, I set a record. It was really hard work. It was a place where I spent a lot of time navigating my cousins and my uncles and aunties and my relatives, because everyone thinks if you're in a position of influence or power, you can somehow do something for them. And I always told them, I'm an equal opportunity no. No across the board. That can't do that for you. But it was really good work for me to return home, to fulfill that promise I made to my father, to commit to coming back to the reservation, because it's hard to leave and then to go back. It's a strange experience, and I would joke often that we should have a reservation re-entry program for folks like myself who leave and come back and all of a sudden are like, oh, you had children with who? Like, wait a minute, you're my cousin? It just was a really different experience for me. But while I was there, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the things I had done in my career, the 10 years of work that I did advocating at the United Nations, the work with tribes in the Midwest around transportation, a ton of communications work, all the things that I was curious about in life, which I felt like maybe didn't serve the very linear career path that the college tells you to take, like you do this, and then you do that, and then you're successful. I did the things that I thought were interesting. I didn't follow that career path. When you serve in a role where you have such a large community and you're nation building, that's your job, is to be a part of nation building, you kind of have to know a lot about everything. So in the end, when I got there, I realized that career path that I had taken across the country and around the world actually served me really well. What brought me here to the state of Washington was I really felt like I needed to use my voice. And I wasn't a tribal council member, and I have no desire to run for tribal council. I support the people that do, but don't want to do it. And I said, I think I have this idea, and it's something that's been percolating in my mind for a long time. When we talk about the environmental movement, conservation movement, we always talk about lands, territories, and resources. And we are talking about the lands, territories, and resources of the first peoples who were here. But they're never a part of the conversation. They're never at the table. They're never included. Tribal nations. They're not there. And it was notably absent in my work throughout my career. It was very notable at the United Nations. I was looking around for tribal leaders who represented their people, and I saw very, very few of them. And it really, I had a lot of internal conflict about it, because the way that I was taught in my community is if I wanted to speak for my community, I would have to be delegated that authority. I'd have to be entrusted with that authority from my people. I didn't have that. So within the United Nations work, the international work, I knew that. I was very conscientious of that, not representing my people in an authoritative way, that I needed to go and talk with them. And so it was this conflict that I was experiencing at the international level about the absence of tribal leadership. So I stepped back from that, came here and said, what if we just indigenize the environmental work? What if I go to this organization, which is a historically white-led organization, and we just Indian it up, So kind of crazy, but that's how I ended up in the city of Seattle, running this environmental organization and bringing in Native folks to work there, and also working with tribal nations in the state. So it's been an adventure. I have tripped and fall a whole bunch of times, like I'm learning, make mistakes, but it's really exciting to be here with all of you. And I will be doing more talking than I normally would because Fawn's not here, which I'm super bummed that she's not here. She's one of my sheroes. But just really excited and honored to be a part of this conversation. And with relatives from different parts of the world, I think the international work is where I learned and saw myself and my struggle and my people's struggle in other communities. And it was powerful. Like, I can vividly remember the power in seeing that solidarity in a way that you've never seen before. So I'm going to transition to the next conversation. I was reading somewhere that globally 1.4 million people may have to relocate due to rising waters, climate change. And we know that there's this impact on communities that we're seeing: rising water, the loss of land, the loss of snow on our mountains, the loss of salmon in our rivers. We are usually the ones that are first hit and hit the hardest, and yet we're the stewards of those same resources. We've been taking care of them for so long. More than half of the world's land is in the care of indigenous peoples, about 80% of our biodiversity. Share with us what the impact of climate change has been on the communities that you've seen and that you know.
Thank you for that question. Well, it is true that our peoples are always at the front lines of the impacts of climate change. That is true. From my perspective as a Micronesian, we have atolls, and I don't know if you know what atolls are. They're very low-lying islands that are not more than 4 to 5 feet above sea level. But people have been living in these lands for centuries, living and thriving in that environment. And also, we've been living on the ocean. The land and the ocean is right now being threatened because of climate change. And there are islands right now that are actually underwater. People always talk about sea level rise as like something in the future. It is our present. Right now, going back to Micronesia and visiting, there were places that we used to run on the beach, and now it's not there anymore. And the reality of climate change, you know, often conversations become very technical and very scientific, which is important. But they also make you think about it theoretically and think of it as this faraway concept. But these are things that are happening really on the ground. That impacts the livability of the islands. That impacts our economies. That impacts how people make decisions about their families and where to go. I am part of the diaspora, the people who have had to make the difficult decision to leave the islands and then, you know, come and relocate to places like the United States. Now, the United States is beautiful too, but I'd rather be out on the ocean in Micronesia. Those are some of the difficulties that really impact people's lives. And it's not like you just, you know, pack up and move over to the next city or the next county. To leave the islands is like uprooting an oak tree from its soil. But it's also like taking a plant that's meant to grow in that climate and then trying to grow it in a different soil. If you ever farmed or planted anything, you know how difficult that is. That's almost impossible. So those are the types of impacts that are impacting families. We should look at climate change as not just impacting the biodiversity or our physical world. It is impacting the very families and the legacies that our families will carry to the next generations. The loss of culture from the standpoint of my children. They've never been to Micronesia. Although they speak the language, it seems like a foreign place to them. That's going to impact how well they are going to succeed in life, because there is often a sense of non-connection. They have to think about whether they are really Micronesians or whether they're really Americans, because they're told that they're not. So I bring that as kind of a way to humanize the impact of climate change on people. But whenever we talk about places like Micronesia, first of all, let me just say that we never called ourselves Micronesian, and the word micro is very demeaning. There is nothing small about Micronesia. I have refused to use that word small or tiny or little to refer to the Micronesian islands or the Pacific Islands. The Pacific covers most of the planet. And also, when we come to the table, don't count how many human beings we represent. We come to the table representing millions of square miles of ocean and billions of life forms. We speak for them when we come to the table and discuss what are we going to do with the changing climate that's impacting our lives and the lives of our fish, the lives of our coral reefs, the lives of our people and the land that we grow up on and live on and love and feel a sense of connection to. So that's what I wanted to say about the impacts of climate change. Yes, there is acidification of the oceans. Yes, there is loss of biodiversity. Yes, there's coral bleaching. The salinity of the water has changed, so fish have to move as well. Tuna fish stocks that are going through the oceans are part of our natural resources that we've depended on for many years. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's more controlled by the forces that that value produce, make money at all costs, rather than how do we conserve that. In Chuukese, there's a word that we say, age garikiti. Basically, that means take, but leave also. It's a word for conservation that's embedded in how we speak in our language. The techniques and the strategies that we are taking on right now that control the narrative about climate change are not new words. These are words that are embedded in the people who were actually born to safeguard our planet, to safeguard the natural resources that our lives depend on.
I would agree with everything that Joe just said, and maybe just to talk a little bit about, to build on what you said and talk about some of the impacts, and then also some of the impacts that we see in Hawaii. So, I was doing a little bit of research last night just on some of the statistics. So, islands globally, as Joe said, I think are often thought of, even in the UN context, it's the small island developing states. But collectively, islands are home to 11% of the world's population. And by the end of this century, 48 islands are expected to be lost to rising seas. And this is already, as Joe said, causing massive displacement of populations. And that is creating friction in a lot of places. And Joe and I were having a conversation about some of the racism that exists in Hawaii, because you do have migration that is climate related occurring and accelerating. And so there are impacts on people, on families that are very real as a result of climate. And again, I think, as you said, we think about these as sort of future challenges, but these are things that people are experiencing today. In the international context, and I know we'll talk about the negotiations in a little bit, but one of the big questions is around this idea of loss and damage, right? So extreme weather, disasters, floods, droughts, et cetera, have increased more than 800% over the past 2 decades. And since 2017, the donor nations in the international community have only met about half of the appeals for aid as a result of these increasing disasters. And so that's left almost $33 billion in shortfall in terms of aid needs experienced in many cases by our island communities. And then if we look at climate adaptation needs in island nations, the projected cost by 2030 annually is $12 billion. So we have massive financial impacts. And again, not to get ahead of ourselves, but what we're really seeing in the international negotiations is a failure to meet those needs. And we're seeing that obviously not existing in a vacuum, but islands are highly aid dependent. The Pacific is the most aid dependent region in the world. 8% of the regional GDP is foreign aid. And yet, when you look at the UN's Green Climate Fund, which is this fund that was established really with the goal of providing financial support, particularly to developing countries, only 2 projects have been approved in islands in the Pacific. No projects have been approved in the Caribbean yet. And at the same time, we're seeing obviously the impacts of the COVID pandemic impacting finances and financial challenges in islands. Many islands have debt to GDP ratios that are exceeding 100%. And then this is on top of this being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, because we have we live in a reality where islands are very heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. And so as the cost of these fossil fuels is rising, that is increasing the debt burden on islands, and undermining, liquidity and solvency of these island economies. So I think all of that is important as context, but I think, as Joe pointed out, there are also all these intersectional issues, right? So it's not just the debt, it's not just the environmental impacts that Joe mentioned. And in Hawaii, for example, we are facing a number of climate-related crises and challenges. So ironically, you think of Hawaii as a very wet, verdant place. We're actually in drought right now, and that is because we are receiving our rainfall in more concentrated periods of time. So we're getting a lot of rain all at once, which is creating issues of flooding, property damage, loss of life. And then we don't have the water stored to be able to make use of it. This is obviously being exacerbated also on the island of Oahu, where I live, by the current and historical issue with the military at Red Hill, where the military built a fuel storage tank directly over the main water aquifer on Oahu, and that fuel tank, it turns out, has leaked into the aquifer, and so we have a situation where families on that part of the island are having to ration water because that water is now undrinkable. And so again, there are all these sort of intersectional challenges that we're facing. On the land board, which I sit on, another issue that we're facing is coastal erosion. And we're having, earlier this year, we had a house on the coast fall into the sea. And what we're seeing is a lot of people who can afford it taking matters into their own hands, hiring land movers to literally dredge huge amounts of sand and move the sand to protect their homes. And that actually accelerates coastal erosion because it removes the sand that is protecting the coast from the energy of the wave surge. And so we now have to grapple with this question of, what do we do about people who are living on these coastlines, and how do we think about, from the perspective of equity, people who can afford to move land illegally, and what to do about that, and people who can't. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think, Joe, you touched on this too, but there's just the question of the loss of natural resources and biodiversity that are really inherently connected to culture. right? So Hawaii is a biodiversity hotspot. We're home to, I believe, the majority of endemic species in the United States. Many beautiful bird species that are found nowhere but else but in Hawaii. And in the theme of mosquitoes, we're seeing that with rising temperatures, the mosquito population is able to move to higher altitudes because it's warmer. And so the mosquito population is decimating the native bird population. And so while we already have been at risk for so long of losing many of these species, which again exist nowhere else in the world, we've recently, made some gains in trying to protect these species. And then now, as we see the impacts of climate, we're once again facing the possibility that they may disappear forever.
Thank you. I know if Fawn was here, your stories of losing community to the water, to the ocean, is something that would resonate. On the Quinault Indian Reservation, the community of Tohola is facing the same thing, where it's starting to be taken over by the sea, returning to the sea. Your stories made me think of a documentary film that I saw on Nutak, called Nutak, about the Yupik people in Alaska, and very similar. Their land, they're losing their permafrost. The land is literally falling into the sea. And there was a scene where a gentleman had a tape measure, and he measured from a point, and he would pull that out, and he would say, today we lost this much land. It's happening that fast. And their story is their own struggle of trying to get the federal government to help them relocate their village, and how that has impacted them as a community to make that decision to have to leave, because that's their home, that's their place, and they're losing it to the ocean. Reflecting on Central Oregon, High Desert Plateau, I think a lot about when we go out and we dig roots and we go pick huckleberries, how the seasons have changed because of climate change. It gets hotter sooner, so things are ready to be harvested sooner. And sometimes we miss those time frames because we can't get off of work, or we have other things pulling at us, and we get out there. And I remember one year, a couple years ago, I went out with my sister to dig roots, and everything was dried up. Like, the ground was hard, and we couldn't dig. And I just remember feeling sad because previously that was the right window, and it's no longer the right window. And so we're seeing in my own community in Central Oregon on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation a change of seasons when things are harvestable, when we would go out and dig, or we would gather, or even when we would fish. It's changing because of the changing climate. So these are really powerful things that people are experiencing. Indigenous peoples and all peoples of this world on the front line are experiencing those impacts in very real and profound ways. I know we'll talk about this sooner, but I don't want to lose that conversation about UN funding, because that's in my thoughts here. One of the most amazing things that I think about communities of color and Indigenous peoples is the amazing amount of leadership that happens. It's a different type of leadership. It comes with a lot of humility. It's grounded in culture and identity, in who we are, in our songs and our ceremonies. And it's different from the majority culture. And I think that sometimes that kind of challenges people who are not familiar with it, because they're accustomed to hearing a certain thing, that you must be assertive, you must have a college degree, you must have gone to some special school and have the piece of paper, the credentials. But the leadership in our communities is full of brilliance. Can you share some of the things that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander communities are already doing that need to be better understood and recognized in this work?
Oh, wow. So many things. I mean, I think we've touched on it already here, but, in Hawaii there is this concept of aloha aina, which is love of land. But I think, as we all know in this room, the idea of land is not separate from ourselves. right? The idea of Aina includes us as humans. It's our makua, it's our ancestor. And so I think that has been, that's a part of how we operate. It's a part of how we, about how we think about stewardship. It's a part of how we think about how we address the climate crisis. And so there has been a lot of work going on in Hawaii to think about sort of the application of this idea of aloha aina in the context of climate. And actually, in sort of the wake of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the state really shut down, and that obviously had a huge impact on the economy. But it also created an opportunity for people to think about what a Hawaii might look like that would not be based on an extractive tourist economy. What would that future, what would that look like? And so there's been a lot of really incredible thinking about that in terms of food security. So obviously the Hawaiian island chain is, one of the most remote places on the planet. We're heavily reliant not only on imported fuels, but also on imported food. And so there has for a long time been a movement to try to build more local agricultural capacity, particularly with the closure of a lot of the sugar plantation and pineapple plantation. And so I think a lot of really incredible work at the community level, thinking essentially about how we reclaim that land for agriculture, for food independence, and really as a way of sort of providing, I guess, what we would call mutual aid, right? I think there is also just a lot of really incredible organizing going on around ideas of sort of at the intersection of climate and self-determination. And I hope we'll be able to spend a little bit more time on that question as well. But if you look at a lot of the social movement that has been happening in Hawaii, including around Mauna Kea and the 30-meter telescope, TMT, where you saw kupuna elders, everybody from kupuna down to, keiki, out protesting the construction of this massive telescope on Mauna Kea, which is essentially sort of the cradle of the beginning of our origin story as a people. I think you're really seeing that that movement, I think, reinvigorating a lot of energy, a lot of interest in land, and then thinking about what the implications are, again, of climate with that. So, yeah, maybe I'll stop there. And Joe, I don't know what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Those are really important points there. I also want to just mention a few things. In terms of thinking about how we couch our work on the global stage, whether in policy or climate, management, there are, as I mentioned before, there's a wealth of knowledge and wisdom that is rooted in our cultures, and I'll just name a few. For example, the art of navigation. So, if navigation is a ancient, not very ancient, because a lot of our people still practice it today. In the Pacific Islands, people have been traveling the world over on very sophisticated navigational, astronomical knowledge passed down through centuries. Navigators were able to travel distances, that would circumvent the entire planet, 2-3 times over. But that really shows that people were really in tune with nature. They knew when the stars would rise and when they would, set, or when the currents are a certain way. They would know what kind of species live in this part of the ocean, and so they can calculate how deep the waters are where they're at. They'll be traveling out in the open ocean. But people really had to go through a system of understanding and knowing their environment, but also paying respect to their elders. And I think this kind of a system of living really informs a lot of the work that we do. And Micronesia, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands have been leaders on the world stage, calling for world leaders to look at the world on a holistic level, to understand that everything is connected. And so its oppression, as Troy mentioned, is also very connected. These are things that we can, see a trajectory of oppressing and then deteriorating the lands and the oceans and the natural resources that we live from. There's also the idea of family. Now, we talked a lot yesterday about family and relationships. Those are not just buzzwords. They're real. We come down to a level of relationship. Now, I'll just use an example of some of the organizing work that the Micronesian community did in Oregon. As you know, our relationship with the United States is enshrined in a treaty called the Compact of Free Association, or Kofa. This allows for Micronesians to travel to the United States without the need for a visa, vice versa for U.S. citizens. But also, the United States maintains full military power over the entire Micronesian region, which is close to 3 million square miles of ocean. So people then can move to the U.S., and they do. A lot of us have moved to the Pacific Northwest. Actually, Pacific Northwest is the probably home to the largest Micronesian population outside of, I think, Guam and Hawaii. There's a lot of us here. But when we moved here, that free association, we thought, would promise us a chance to integrate into society and be able to thrive. That wasn't really true and realized. Why? Because there were barriers, such as federal policies. 1996, that's when the Welfare Reform Act was ratified. And basically what that did was it recategorized eligibility for social services and programs like Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, food stamps, and everything that is funded by the federal government. Micronesians were categorically barred from those services in 1996. So for 20 plus years, people have been trying to survive in this society and paying taxes to the federal, state, and local governments while not being able to access the very programs that are funded by those tax dollars. Basically, it's taxation without representation. It is an injustice. So for over 20 or so years, we've been trying to advocate for this and move Congress to do something about it, to change it, and it's never gone through. The Micronesian community did not give up. They came together and organized in state legislatures. I'll use Oregon as an example. When we came to the legislature in Oregon 7 years ago, or 8, nobody knew what Micronesia was. And for a Micronesian, I'm like, hey, you don't know anything about Micronesia? And show of hands, before today, how many of us knew what Micronesia was? Good. How many of you know Chuk? Yes, Pohnpei? Koshrai? Yap? Oh, she rose her hand the whole time. But when we came there, we realized that, you know, out of sight, out of mind. People just don't know. But we don't want people to just know us on paper. We don't just want to write Micronesia and put it in and say, here's a policy priority, please make something happen. No, what we did was we spent time to come to every single member of the Oregon legislature and educate them and talk to them and create relationships. There were times we invited them to our parties, our chemims. You don't know what a chemim is, you have to know. A Marshallese birthday party, which basically is a party and everybody on the island is invited to come. And they do that on the first birthday of every child. It's wild. It's like spring break, you know. It's just, everybody is just. We invited senators and representatives to come to those because we don't want just their policy advocacy. We want the relationship. And when we built those relationships, we came back to the legislature. We sat in on hearings, we testified, and they knew us. They looked out and they smiled when we were before them because they knew us by name. We knew them by name. They texted me, and there was at one point I meet a senator somewhere, and he would say, "Oh, Micronesia." I don't know if I would get mad but I was happy that at least he knew. Every single member of the legislature in Oregon knows what Micronesia is and what the Kofa issues are because we spent time building relationships. It's not a gimmick. It's just the way we are. We build relationships. We've introduced now over 7 bills, including access to health care, access to employment, access to in-state tuition, money donated to our COVID-19 work in the millions, passed all those bills, and get this is not an exaggeration, without a single negative vote over 7 years. Now, I don't say that to brag. I say that because those are some of the values that are just innate in us, that are part of our culture, that really make an impact even today. So that's, you know, kind of an example of what power we have, what we can do if we stay true to who we are.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in and follow up on one point? I just wanted to, off the back of that, I think what you were saying about just the power of community is so right. And one of the things that came before the land board recently was a plan that was developed by the community of Miloli'i for collective management of our fisheries and or their fisheries on the Big Island. And the community took it upon themselves to self-organize and to develop a plan essentially for culturally based management of that fishery stock. That's the kind of thing that we need to inform climate policy if we're going to be making equitable policies that benefit communities in the future. And I think really an area in Hawaii where policymakers are not ready yet, where communities are not resourced yet to be able to do that. And so I know the question of what philanthropy can do is for later in the panel, but I really do think that one thing philanthropy can be doing is providing support to communities to organize in those ways, because that's so important.
Thank you. I'm so disappointed to let you know that we're at time, but I am going to take a little bit more time just to do some closing thoughts. First of all, just want to thank you both for your stories. The things that you're sharing, I find myself connecting to your stories, hearing a lot of things that resonate in my heart, and I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. It's hard work, but it's good work. In the conversations today, I heard a lot of love for community and love for land, connection to land, that is core to who we are as indigenous peoples, as peoples from place. That the place that you come from is where your creation story originates, and you shared a little bit about your creation stories, as did I. I heard a lot about community and belonging, being a part of something, a collective, a people, and working on behalf of your people, to be in relationship with one another, and the recognition that that starts early, at the big birthday party at 1 year old, that we come together to celebrate, we come together to organize, we come together to get to know one another. Maybe the end results might be a policy, but the beginning of it is always about relationship. Who's your parents? Who's your family? What community, what village do you come from? And those are all things that are beautiful about who we are. The final thing that I heard a lot of is traditional ecological knowledge, the amazing brilliance that we have in our communities that is today being validated by Western science. For all of us reading things, we're like, yeah, we knew that. We knew how to navigate. We weren't just like going in circles around our island. Like we knew all of this, right? We've been taking care of our lands. We have all this knowledge. Listen to us. Listen to us. Words are really powerful, extremely powerful these days. And I'm looking at my notes and it says, you have the opportunity to talk to funders. What would you say? I would say listen to us. Listen to our communities. Listen to tribal nations. Do less talking. Spend more time in the community, listening and learning from us. Our communities contain an amazing amount of information, an amazing amount of love for the people and for the land. Trust us to make our own decisions. Trust us to come with the solutions to solve the problems that we are facing. We don't need to be saved. We never needed to be saved. I would also add that I've heard a lot of references today about tribal nations, and as a kid who grew up on the res, who spent my whole career thinking, reading, advocating on behalf of treaty rights, believing in my people and my leadership, disagreeing quite a bit with them, but believing in them. Tribal nations are an incredible opportunity for communities to connect, for us to build solidarity efforts around issues. In the environmental conservation movement, a lot of folks are standing behind tribes, but not in partnership with tribes, putting our treaty rights out at the front, not recognizing the tremendous risk that we take, that our nations take when we do that. A bad decision for one nation impacts all of us. And it's important for the environmental community, the conservation community, funders, grassroots communities to know that in addition to working with indigenous peoples, you also need to have that track to work with tribal nations. For funders that are out there supporting grassroots organizations, please also support their ability to have time to engage with tribal nations in the states that they live in, to be able to show up in the community, to have the resources to build relationships with one another, to get to know who their leadership is, not just their elected leadership, but the people who go into the longhouse, into the smokehouses, their traditional leadership. But that's part of this movement that I'm seeing is this connection to tribes, and it's a really difficult work to do for natives that have worked in tribes. You know how hard it can be, but it's a track that needs to be resourced, not only for tribes, but for nonprofit grassroots organizations that are doing any type of environmental policy in the state. Fund them to connect with tribal nations as well. Fund intermediaries like Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Bring resources to the community for people to connect. Sometimes it's not always about that end policy result. Sometimes it's about that relationship. And what I hope to see more of in the state of Washington is a solidarity between tribal nations and communities, frontline communities, grassroots communities, because we need that. And teaching anybody how to organize is like the best thing ever. I'm a firm believer that if we could just teach all tribal people how to organize, we already do know how to organize, but like how to organize, that we would grow and blossom from within and create a massive movement for the betterment of our communities. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much, Native Americans in Philanthropy. Thank all of you for all the incredible work that you do, your good hearts, your good minds, and I look forward to seeing you, continuing to see you in the struggle. We're going good places.
Let's give one last applause to Alyssa, Joe, and Amy. You know that this discussion speaks to me. I know it speaks to a lot of those in the audience here, and really goes to what came to my mind was protection of our way of life. When we look at these places, these sacred places, these places that we've lived for thousands of years, that we've fished and we've harvested and we've navigated and we've connected with each other, and we've developed legacies and foundations that we still carry on today. Well, those are at risk. You know, climate change is taking away our land, it's taking away our resources, our first foods, and that has a direct connection to our culture and our way of life. So this is important work, and I really want to applaud those folks that are here that spoke on the panel, but also all those communities that they represent and the folks who are on the ground, grassroots, the tribal leaders, the community leaders, the nonprofit leaders, all those who are standing on their shoulders and trying to protect that way of life. And hopefully you've been inspired here, some funders in the audience, to help lift up that work and support them here in the United States, but internationally at the UN. And we have some important discussions. You know, COP is coming up in Egypt, and we've been building upon the indigenous efforts to take the lead, to flex our muscle, you know, our indigenous traditional ecological knowledge muscle to help solve this problem. And so we need help to amplify those voices, to get them in those spaces so that we can protect our way of life. Well, we're about at lunch, about at break, but we have one awesome treat left for you. Just keeps getting better and better. We have a special virtual message from the first Native American U.S. Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. Yes. She is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Yeah. Yes. And so you can roll the footage from Joy.
Kenje, Stongo, Yat Eabina, Aloha, Goatsi, good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, to all those coming together here for the Power and Solidarity Gathering. I speak to you from the Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation, Tulsa, Oklahoma. I understand that this is the first time that members of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, and Native American communities and Native nations are coming together for such a gathering. It's a time of celebration for sharing what has been, who we are at this moment in time, and who we are becoming. We are at a time of many changes. Our common origin story is Earth, or Iganajaga, as we call Mother Earth in our Muskogee language. Our relationship with each other, with ourselves, as individuals and members of communities begins here. Our languages and understanding of the meaning of life emerged and is emerging from our origin stories with plants, animals, elements, and the moving thought in the moving thought and dreaming field of the creative force who has many names among us. We are witnessing massive earth shifting because our relationship has shifted from our original teachings. We are witnessing separation and delusionment within our communities at many levels, from global, national to our local communities, our local governing entities. Our fears are fed by addictions. Our children are hungry for community and connection. They want to know how they are part of the story that defines us as diverse communities, as individuals. Even so, we are witness to a major uprising of our young artists, thinkers, and dreamers. They are rising up, making art, writing poetry and stories, becoming community caretakers and organizers, breaking through many fields in which for many years we were invisible, unacknowledged, and without a seat at the table. These children are being born are carrying light for the path ahead of us. What we do here at this gathering, whatever we do, are for them and those who follow them. Whatever we do is for them and those who follow them. We are in one of the most challenging parts of the collective story, and this is the time to stand together, to dream together, to act together. That is why we are here. We need mental and spiritual food along the way, as much as we need food, clothing, and shelter. That is where poetry comes in. Poetry always appears at times of transition, transformation, and shift, and for times of grieving, for getting work done, and for joy. I offer this poem as a gathering together point. It's called For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet. Put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off that cell phone, computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by friendly winds. They travel the earth gathering essences of plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars' ears and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream planning itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasin feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time, who will be there after time. They sit together before the fire that has been without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial insecure jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for the harm we humans have brought down upon them. Don't worry. The heart knows the way. Though there may be high rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you a few hours, a day, a year, a few years, 100, 1,000, or even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense feast set by thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, sage, or other healing plant. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go the pain you are holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, all the way to your feet. Let go the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are coming in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as you would a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces, in tatters. Gather them together. They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it is bathed and given clean clothes. Now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place to go. Make a giveaway and remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark. Which is what this organization, this gathering of organizations is about, is helping us find our way. And giving back to our communities is an important step in the process of growing the story, renewing the story, the origin story, and an important part in seeing what is needed, planning on how to be helpful and doing our part, and then there's the giving back. So finally, a poem that's been with me, has walked with me along my life in the 50 years since I began writing, first publishing poetry. This poem, Remember, teaches me how memory is a living being, and we add to it, can even shift memory to lift everyone up in understanding and compassion. So Mado, thank you, mahalo nui loa, and for your part in renewing our communities. And Mado, thank you for honoring me by asking me to be a part of this gathering, of this very important gathering. And now I'll read, remember. Remember the sky you were born under, know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon, know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn, that is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father, he is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are, red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them, listen to them, they are alive poems. Remember the wind, remember her voice, she knows the origin of this universe. Remember that you are all people and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing as you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance that language is, that life is. Remember, remember.
Such an honor to have Joy create that poem for us today, and I'll take her advice to heart and keep this speech short. But I hope this morning inspired you to think about things a little differently. Hopefully it sparked some conversation throughout the rest of the day. And I really want to thank everybody who was on stage here today for sharing their stories, their families, their gifts. Go back to Swill, and that's what, and I hope you share your gifts with us throughout the rest of the Power and Solidarity Conference. So, thank you.